Welcome to r/RedditRevenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. Thank you friends for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. Uncle was arrested and humiliated after he told me, "You are not my brother now." The second story. Boss didn't pay me wages, so I had his laptop with personal information. The first story is Escalating Feud Leads to Dad Orchestrating His Brother's Arrest. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slimeball with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance, but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace, because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far, and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres, and runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had a more limited inventory than other dealers, in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop and office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop, my uncle and my dad both would collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do, they could go get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price, and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. A no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenage girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle's an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later, my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother. They were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine, and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the office a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is peeved off, he's really peeved off, so he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house, due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual, and was always spying on my dad's house. So my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and left. The next day, apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there, the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time. I kid you not. This time he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him. Like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again, I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior, because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who'd been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it, even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him, and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered. And by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It isn't a restraining order because it isn't issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It's for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he'd been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The ProRevenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were, and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are, and maintains wooden stobs in the ground periodically along his property line. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property, by a few feet, and moved the stobs back the same distance. So basically it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random piece of scrap across the fake property line, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stobs. Set up a few game cameras aimed at the line and waited. Sure enough, his dumb A brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed this scrap on his side of the property line, crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap, and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land, and it was my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle. But alas, he had to make do with someone he and his brother had gone to high school with, which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well, and who could make sure everyone else in town knew. Edit. Nothing really came of my uncle's arrest, or at least not that my dad has heard about, and he'd hear about it since this is a town of like 600-ish people. But it was probably enough for my uncle just to have to get put into handcuffs, spend a night in jail, and have people know about it, because my uncle hasn't caused any more trouble for my dad, other than generally existing where my dad occasionally has to see his truck drive by. My uncle's also now in a business dispute with his wife's sister and his brother-in-law, so presumably he's trying to take his anger out on another target, who hasn't already beaten him, and also who isn't his older and much larger brother, who's been perfectly willing to beat his A all their lives, whenever it's devolved into physical disputes. Yes, my family are rednecks. My uncle, aunt, cousin, and my cousin's wife all unfriended me on social media, so I only know what's going on with them via small-town gossip nowadays. My sister was driving down the road recently, saw my uncle in his yard and waved at him. He turned away like he didn't know her. None of us got an announcement when my cousin's wife had her baby recently, so I think the end of the story is just that we're all dead to my uncle and his family, but he's too afraid to do anything besides pretend we all don't exist. Edit. This is a town of like 600 people, and my family owns all the land on that street anyway. They'd been living across a dirt road and private drive from each other all their adult lives. The house my uncle lives in now was built by my dad when he and my mom first married, but when my dad inherited his grandpa's old farmhouse next door, he moved into it and sold the old house. A couple families lived in it over the years, until eventually my uncle bought it, which my dad couldn't control. As for being in business together, my dad just put up with everything my uncle threw at him over the years, because he did know how my uncle is, and didn't want to create a big rift between them, especially not while my grandma was still alive. Incidents would happen and he'd be mad for a week or two, then let it go for the sake of peace. But the whole my uncle saying he wasn't his brother anymore, etc., really pushed my dad over the edge and struck a nerve, because he's adopted. The second story is, be sure to pay your IT help. I'd been working at a computer repair shop on a commission-based system. We would get PCs in and the techs would not get paid until the repair work was paid for, and if the client did not pay for the work performed, the shop would take possession after a time and resell the equipment. It was not uncommon for the techs to be screwed out of work they had done. To make this job sound even more appealing, the shop owner would throw PCs from his friends and family to fix, which was not paid work. I was looking forward to a pretty big check due to just cranking out the repairs, but I found out that these were all friends of the owners, so I worked for free for those 2 weeks. One of the things that we do is pull the HDs and create a complete image of the whole drive for archival protection to be wiped after the job is done. Turns out that the owner of the computer shop and his wife were part of the 18+ community, and were hosting a small but local 18+ site that they ran off of the notebook they brought in for repairs. I grabbed the hard drive and told the owner that he needed to pay me for the work I had done. The owner fired me on the spot. I had grabbed my tools and I walked out the door without realizing I had the HD in my hand. The owner had built a reputation in the small town it was located in for being a good Christian business, and the owner portrayed himself as a pillar of the community. I happened to get the information off the drive, and I was able to get access to his passwords, plus close to 4 terabytes of pics and videos of their 18+ website. Waiting on my 3 weeks for the last check, I decided that I would go scorched earth instead of looking for a payout. Step 1. His business. I had some time to look over the labor laws, and found out he violated quite a few of them with me. We were treated as contractors, but he took out taxes and SSI, which he never paid into the system. The other thing was we were required to clock in like hourly employees, but were paid on commission, so due to the pay structure, many employees were getting well under minimum wage for some weeks. Step 2. His reputation. Having the sign-on information, I decided to do a few interesting things with the company website and their 18+ website. I put a link at the bottom of the company webpage, where I directed people to the 18+ site they ran, and I changed the password authentication to allow everyone into the paid areas of the site. I also took down some of the pixelated pictures of him and his current wife, and posted the original pics. It took them about a week to find out about all this. I also sent a mass email to everyone on the owner's email list to check out the 18+ site. I also gave his ex-wife the drive to help her in her court battle. The fallout. Long-standing contracts had terminated by his clients in droves. The labor board did an investigation and fined him for his rule-breaking, and the IRS did an audit, where they found further evidence of his crimes. In the end, he lost his business, his kids, his reputation, and his current wife, because he thought he was too much of a big shot to not pay his IT help. I know that I tend to go overboard when I'm getting my revenge on people, but what I did do and what I could have done was a lot worse. I know that I can be an evil a-hole, and that I do not want to be that guy. I know that I could have made millions with the information on that drive, and I could have ruined a lot more lives than I did. I hope you enjoyed those stories. Don't forget to subscribe.